Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Lead Prosper West webinar on one-to-one consent. We're going to be sharing a couple of commonly asked questions. But before we get started, we're going to allow people to join this meeting and introduce our two speakers for today. So first up is our CEO, Ross. With 18 years of experience in online lead generation and marketing, Ross brings expertise in both tech and business sides of this industry in lead gen. He is a passionate mountain biker, and Ross lives just outside of our headquarters in Asheville, North Carolina, with his wife and three sons. Our next
Hey, you
speaker,
got
oh, sorry.
oh, all good.
Our next speaker is Garrett. Garrett brings nearly 2 decades of expertise in intermarketing and e-commerce development. He's been immersed in the lead generation space for the past few years as well. After relocating his family from Fort Lauderdale to Asheville, North Carolina, he now spends his free times with his family, enjoying vintage watches and cars and crying over the New York Jets. Just a short disclaimer before we begin this webinar. The topics discussed in this webinar are open for interpretation. This information provided during this webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Attendees are encouraged to consult with a qualified legal professional regarding any specific questions or concerns they may have regarding one-to-one consent. When we look at the layout of this overall webinar, we're going to be going over common themes and issues that have come as we've set up one-to-one campaigns with our customers and looked at the general landscape of the lead gen industry. After going over some common themes, we're going to open this session to Q&A. So if you have any questions during the first 20 minutes or so, feel free to put those questions in the Q&A chat, and we'll be sure to answer those after. After that generalized Q&A, we'll be going over our one-to-one consent feature. And during that time, if you have any questions, once again, please feel free to put those in the chat. Well, let's begin. So first off, Ross, when you look at the general landscape of the lead gen industry, what's your view of general preparedness of lead generators for that January 2025 deadline?
So I feel like a lot of lead generators are still not ready. I believe they underestimated the front end work needed to dynamically display the TCPA names on their forms and funnels. There are, on the flip side, there are many companies who have been testing for months. They'll be, ahead of the curve, but there are still people trying to figure things out now, which is a little worrisome. And we've been having a lot of calls lately. We're helping clients. So you kind of have, there's a handful of people who have been testing for a while, and then you have a lot of people who are just getting started, in the last minute.
That definitely seems to be the experience that we've been having, even on the Lead Prosper side. Garrett, do you have anything to add or any layers to add to that question?
I would say the biggest issue is definitely the front end, the ability to be able to, do the ping. It's essentially still a ping and a post now, but being able to take that user data, the customer data that's coming back, display it dynamically, collect that consent, and then post it through. So the being able to display it on the front end in a way that is still compliant, while also the back end functionality that's just lacking. There's a lot of buyers who still haven't provided updated specs on what they're going to be doing. And there's also a lot of confusion around, whether or not you need to collect it, if you're an end buyer versus if you're dealing with, for example, lead aggregators. So there's a lot of just confusion. And I think it's been what's a big factor in causing this sort of delay in adoption to the new one-to-one consent ruling before the actual deadline.
Absolutely. I think we're all kind of getting prepared for this particular deadline in the next month, and it seems like it's a crunch time for a lot of lead generators and businesses. Garrett, back to you. Are there any specific industries or types of businesses that seem to be lagging in readiness for the new ruling? If so, why do you think that is?
I don't necessarily know if it's a specific industry as a whole, but I do feel like some of the bigger verticals like insurance have taken more aggressive steps to figure out how they're going to handle one-to-one consent. But the other issue isn't so much with like the specific industries, but we've just been seeing a lot of solutions that are separated across the different industries. Like, for example, some industries are kind of like avoiding the API setup and moving strictly to widgets and not really taking into account how that's going to affect lead generators moving forward. So it's not about them not being prepared, but more so kind of rushing almost and providing solutions that aren't going to work for the overall industry as a whole. And it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out because it's giving a lot of issues for the front end generators. And I think that's going to be a bigger problem than anything involving like the actual back end configurations that are going to be needed.
Can you talk to us? We obviously have a variety of attendees on this particular webinar, from people who have dove straight into one-to-one consent and began their build outs to people who have not even started their one-to-ones. Can you explain what a widget is and how that's interlacing in some of the setups that we're seeing?
Yeah, so a widget's pretty standard, but basically what happens is a ping goes through, and on the ping response from the buyer, instead of returning a list of bids or whatnot, they're returning essentially a token. And then for on the landing page, for on the front end, the users have to have the ability to take that token from the ping response, insert it into JavaScript that's inserted on the page, and use that to essentially create a box on your landing page that is controlled by the end buyer that is going to be displaying their buyers, their bids, and any other TCPA information necessary. And that's kind of how a widget is going to be working. The problem is that it completely removes any sort of customizability for the front end generators, but also what it's doing is it's removing any sort of ability to split test, to make it mesh well. It kind of removes any ability to work with multiple buyers because it's really designed for sort of like a exclusive setup where you're exclusively selling to this buyer. And the other fault is that once you're using a widget, the idea of being able to collect data based on how users are interacting with it is kind of limited to what the buyer is willing to share with you. So it kind of pigeonholes people into this very like small corner of like your widget is going to display your buyers, you have no control over it, and good luck. And I think that it's for some users it'll work great, for some generators it's going to work great, but I think for a lot of people it's going to wind up causing more problems than a solution.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the elaboration on that. Obviously, it helps us just to tie some of the themes that we're seeing in this webinar. Ross, I'm going to repeat the question because I know we went a little bit off track there. Do you think there's any industries or types of businesses that seem to be lagging in your opinion?
So, we have like health insurance or CMS, they mandated the one-to-one, way before the deadline for this year's open enrollment. That was interesting. I don't know how that worked out for everybody. Others like kind of rushed in as well, and they didn't really communicate with, with Lead Prosper or other LMSs, to my knowledge. And, like as Garrett mentioned, there's some aggregators out there who have, issues with their APIs or how they work, or they're not typical, and that will cause a lot of problems for your owned and operated users or your lead generators who are used to a typical ping post. There are some aggregators who are having a ping post model, which is, a lot of the LMSs out there aren't built for that. So it's kind of a mix of people, rushing in and again, waiting to the last minute. And, we're just doing our best, to work with everyone. And, the way our campaign was built out is very dynamic, and typically we can work with almost any API out there. So we're very proud of that.
We love to hear it. I'm going to tie this to some of the awareness that we've seen in the last 6 months, even 8 months, going back. Ross, how has awareness of one-to-one consent ruling evolved over the last year? Are lead generators, again, becoming more informed, or in your opinion, are they still playing catch up?
So I believe most people are pretty aware, but everyone has questions. I talk to clients, customers daily. Everyone's still not 100% sure. They have an idea. And the weird thing is, law is up to interpretation. So we can all guess all day. We can try to, read between the lines and try to figure out the best way to handle this. My best advice is to confirm whatever you're doing with, your legal counsel to make sure they're comfortable with your strategy. And yeah, in my opinion, most people are still catching up on the development side. Many people are finally just getting their API specs from their buyers, and now they're working on integrating with those API specs. Um, and you got to make sure that your LMS can properly work with those API specs. As I mentioned, some I've seen a few aggregators having a ping post model, or as Garrett mentioned, there's these widgets out there. In our opinion, one-to-one consent shouldn't have strayed off too far from a ping post. All you really need to, in our opinion, all you need to do is ping your buyer network, get back a ping response, and that should have the bid amount, the TCPA information, and anything else you need to dynamically display on that page. And then you should be able to simply post that lead data to the correct buyers, based on what the consumer is picking.
Completely agree on that. Garrett, do you have anything to add on that?
In terms of awareness, not really. I think my biggest issue over the last year was more of an arrogance among the industry of people basically thinking this will never go into effect. And the reality is, the FCC worked both sides of the political spectrum to come up with this ruling. It was put in place for a reason, and everything that we've read, everything that we've been told, everything that consultants have discussed with us, it's going to happen. And I think anyone who is waiting to play catch up and kind of waiting it out to see what happens is going to find themselves in a very bad situation, because there is a ton of front end and there's a ton of back end work that's going to need to be done. And it takes time, it takes testing, and it's going to be very interesting towards the end of January when we see these rulings go into effect, how some of the, how people set this up and get it going quickly, and the mistakes that are going to be made, the successes that are going to happen. And yeah, it's going to be a very interesting time.
I think you bring up a great point in terms of some front end and back end issues, and going to transition our conversation into topics like that. Garrett, I know you've been on the front end in terms of helping our Lead Prosper users transition into one-to-one campaigns. As you begin to build these out for our users, and then additionally users joining the platform recently, what challenges are you seeing on the front end or on the back end as opposed to the front end?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that, we brought up the widgets already. The issue with the widgets on the back end is that it's not an easy way to get the data back and populate it for the post. It's a lot of front end development needed to get that data over. And I think, personally, I think there was no reason, Ross brought this up already, to really need to move away from just using APIs. And we're seeing some major players basically not giving the option to use an API anymore and strictly using these widget type setups. And it's going to make things a lot more tricky for anyone who's trying to work with multiple buyers or multiple aggregators or anything like that, because you're removing sort of the free flowing way of allowing the O&Os to properly collect consent, and you're basically forcing them to use your widget instead of allowing them to properly design it themselves, collect the consent, and just use APIs like this has been going on forever now in the lead gen space for years now. You're making them choose your widget approach, and on the back end it makes things very complicated. But we're working with it. We're working with everyone to come up with solutions when needed. We've had to come up with custom code to work with these by using proxies almost to pass the data and collect it properly. But we pride ourselves in being able to provide solutions as best as we can, and we're working with everyone. And honestly, the biggest challenges now is kind of a last ditch effort by everyone, especially a lot of buyers who are quickly getting out specs to our users and saying, we need these set up and tests going in the next 2 days. And we as and on the back end and in terms of Lead Prosper are working as much as we can. We're not charging anyone for any extra work needed for these one-to-one campaign setups. Like, we're kind of just dropping everything to help all of our users get set up and migrate over to the one-to-one campaigns as quickly as possible, at no extra charge for our users, because we know the stress that's coming with it. We know that they're they're getting put into these weird situations where they have buyers telling them week over week, we're going to get to those specs soon, and it's mid-December and they're still waiting. And you know, we're just doing everything we can to help our users get set up, and that means providing as much resources as we can, whether it's knowledge, strategy, and actual tech build outs. So, that's what we're working with. And, hopefully our users know that, see how easy it is for us to do it, and things will get rolling pretty quickly.
I did want to have you elaborate on some of the build outs again, because you've been in the weeds, Garrett, in terms of building some of these campaigns out. When you look at the overall build thus far, in terms of time frame it's taken for some of these build outs, what's the least amount of time perhaps that you've seen a one-to-one campaign transition on both back end and front end, as opposed to, what's essentially that average time that we're looking at when it comes to making this transition ahead of the deadline?
Yeah. So that's a tricky question because it's really dependent on collecting all of the information needed, all at once. And unfortunately, a lot of our users are in this position where they're waiting on buyers to get them the information. So I've seen, we've had users come to us and have everything ready to go, and we build out their campaign, and that gives them everything they need to start working on the front end. And thankfully, they have front end developers who are ready to work with this. So that those type of situations, they can be up and running testing in a day or two. But there's a lot of users who are running into multiple problems. One, with getting the specs from their buyers, but also two, on the front end, not having a development team, not having the resources available or the knowledge to code it on the front end, or being set up on their landing pages on platforms where they don't have the functionality built in to be able to properly ping an API, take a response, using that response, parse the data, and start the next action, which is what's needed to properly collect the consent. So in those cases, they might have to come up with new solutions. They might have to migrate to a new landing page software. We thankfully, we have a product coming out very soon that we've talked about called Consumer Consent, which is going to be essentially a middleware that'll allow these, front end people who are not able to integrate with their landing page, CMS, or whatever it is, to basically post to consumer consent. We'll handle the LMS side of it, and whatnot. And Ross could talk more about that product, but basically, like I said, it really comes down to what's available, their front end capabilities, and what their buyers have. And we have people that have been good to go on the front end side for 3 weeks now, who are now waiting on the back end still for the buyer setup. So it really, really, really just depends on, a lot of factors. And I wish it was a lot better answer, but if you have devs on the front end, you have all your buyer, configurations and specs ready on the back end, we can have a campaign migrated in a day or two. And that's something that I think is incredible, but everything needs to align correctly for that to really happen.
I think you bring up a lot of valid points in terms of general preparation for things. You also addressed a little and touched a little bit on front end challenges. And to this, I'm going to ask Ross, if you can elaborate on any additional front end challenges that you're seeing as we begin these setups. Do you think there's any surprises that you've seen on the front end thus far?
I think most companies are realizing how much dev work is needed. If they don't have an in-house dev team, or if they're using, something like swipe pages or unbounce, they might not even be able to facilitate one-to-one consent. So, if we have many customers who have in-house dev, and when they do see our API spec, everything clicks. They understand the ping, they know the data they're getting back, they can dynamically display that on the site, they can collect consent, and then post, the right data points to the campaign. But the customers without the dev team, or without, proprietary forms that can do all this, it's kind of becoming a shock. Like, how do I do this? There's a lot of moving parts. And as Garrett mentioned, we do have a product coming out called Consumer Consent that will help companies that are using, products, again, like swipe pages or unbounce, that will, take in the data, redirect to a subdomain on their site, and then allow them to collect that or facilitate that consent that they're looking for. So I think the biggest surprise is just, you need a developer, or, you need to be able to dynamically read that API response and display it on the site and properly collect that consent. And it's not as easy as it was, as it is today, to where you can take a lead in, post it to your LMS and let your LMS figure it out. You actually have to get that consent on the form in real time for that specific buyer. And I think that's the biggest surprise for most people that we're seeing today.
Talk to the individuals on this webinar, Ross, about what is Lead Prosper particularly. How are we assisting our customers or even people migrating onto the platform who may not have their own in-house developer team, who may not have the technical abilities on the front end to support this type of transition? What are we doing in terms of those types of users?
So we've recently started an enterprise level support package. We'll basically, hop on a call with the client. We kind of interview them to make sure that they're a good fit as well. But we can offer, complete form build outs, tech build outs. We basically become a tech team for you. We have a lot of experience building out these forms, funnels, and flows, and we'll make sure everything works the way you want it to. And that's in the last few months, it's really been taken off for us because, as I mentioned, a lot of our clients don't have this tech team or they don't have these front end, dev capabilities, and now we're starting to offer that. But we definitely would want to get on a call, talk to that client and make sure it is a good fit on both sides.
Absolutely. And we love to hear that we're blending a mix of creativity when it comes to support, because often, like, we're finding our users are in kind of different phases where we have full out dev teams versus individuals, again, who don't have the technological capabilities to support this. And essentially, it's nice to hear that Lead Prosper is meeting them where they're at. We're going to shift the conversation to a little bit about general marketing themes that we've seen. We've talked a lot about back end and front end, but Garrett, how are lead generators balancing the need for transparency and consent forms with maintaining user experience, and more particularly the conversion rates?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So earlier, Ross had talked about some users that we've talked to that have been doing and collecting one-to-one consent for the last few months, and they are the ones that have been providing us sort of these like real world examples and conversion rates and things like that, and they're the ones who've been split testing and showing us a lot of this data. And I think really there is no clear cut way to do this, because a lot of industries are going to eventually come out with their own guidelines. So for example, for a long time, there was this understanding that, or this interpretation of the law that was about not being able to have pre-checked checkboxes on your page where users could opt in, or their consent was already opted into for you. And then in the last few months, or even the last few weeks, it's kind of shifted where now it's, okay, you can have pre-selected boxes. However, there needs to be a real-time action that allows a consumer to opt out. That is great, and that provides a different sort of approach for how you can collect the consent, how you display it on the page. For example, you could do sort of like an inline TCPA if you have that ability. But now we're also learning about industries such as insurance, where the major carriers are saying, we will not accept leads that are pre-checked, where the boxes are pre-checked, or we will not consider that consent to be true. So there's not a very clear-cut way of doing this. It's really going to be specific to your industry, your landing page, how you want to collect it. We've seen, and it also comes down to now the different, depending on your industries, the different buyer setups, these widgets that come into effect. We've seen some widgets that are the way that they were strategized didn't make a lot of sense to me, where you send the ping, you send the post, and then after the post is already sent, then you display the widget. And that really throws the whole flow into, a spin, because now essentially on your thank you page, the widget is now expecting your consumers to again opt into something or opt out of something. So it's not a very clear cut, like very easy approach to set it up. You can't just say, do this step, then do this step, and you'll have success. It's like you really need to be working and testing and making sure you're working with your buyers to get any specific guidelines, your industry guidelines, to really work and collect this sort of and build out this flow that is going to work for you, work for your buyers, and work for the industry as a whole that you're in. So I wish there was a clear cut answer there. There just really isn't. There's a lot of strategy that needs to go into it. There's going to be a lot of testing, and it's really only time is going to tell what works and what's going to be passable. So
Sounds like the general theme is testing and more testing. And it
yeah.
definitely makes sense. That is a marketing theme as well. So it's not surprising that this plays into this new ruling. Ross, do you have anything to add that in terms of how lead generators are essentially mixing a blend of adding this one-to-one and providing this consent on their form, but also maintaining conversion rates and particularly even, meeting their CPA targets of where they were at previously?
Yeah, so we've seen everything from the pink pick post methodology. I've also seen the multi-inline consent, being talked about and tested. But it's really going to come down to, like Garrett said, testing and the UX that you want to provide, to that consumer. If you want to keep your conversion rates as similar as they are today, I would definitely consider the multi-inline consent, which is basically having, you already have your typical TCPA text, but now you would have each buyer or potential buyer in that text with a checkbox, before their name. And as Garrett mentioned again, we're hearing everything from pre-checked is allowed, pre-checked isn't allowed, but you would think if pre-checked is allowed, that will keep your conversion rates as, close to what they are today. And I've seen a lot of success, with that method as of today. And yeah, I think it's going to come down to testing, and we're really, and it's hard to say now, but in like a month or two, the really good marketers in our space, we're going to start seeing these trends on what's working. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time for everyone to crack the code as what is converting best, what is legit, what is working, and what is compliant. So it's almost a time will tell, type of deal.
Understood. Kind of want to navigate this conversation to talk a little bit more optimistically about one-to-one consent. Garrett, do you think there's any potential advantages or opportunities for businesses that embrace this ruling?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing we've been talking about this a lot, the theme of this has really been about early adoption, being able to get set up, having those tests going, having A/B testing, optimization testing, and optimizing your conversions. People who are working closely with legal to determine what is going to essentially be allowed. Then the people who are basically have already set up everything are going to be in a much better position because they're going to be the ones who are already set up, tested, optimizing, and really as not waiting to the last minute for the deadline to approach to before they start transitioning. And I think anyone who is going to be waiting to the very end to see how things play out is going to be at a severe disadvantage because of that. There's going to be a mad exodus of people who are just going to give up, I feel like, because it's going to be a lot of development, whether it's cost, whether it's time for the front end, the back end setups. I think a lot of buyers are going to be very happy with people who are already set up and they're already testing things, and you're going to have better relationship with your buyers for it. So there are a lot of benefits there, whether it's from a business relationship standpoint or just in terms of landing page optimization and having that data and having your flow good to go. Testing what works, testing what doesn't, and putting yourself at an advantage because once that deadline comes, there's going to be a drop in volume for people who aren't compliant, and you're going to be able to shine through that.
You bring up a very interesting point in terms of that. A very common theme in our industry is relationships. And having good relationships is huge. So it brings up a very important advantage in terms of continuing that good relationship or even continuing new good relationships as you can gain a competitive advantage because of the fact that you're more strict according to this rule. Ross, I'm going to ask that question to you as well, as again, you've been really in the weeds in terms of some of these initial conversations of people who have been embracing it early. Have you seen any potential advantages or opportunities out there when people do start working on migrating their campaigns before this deadline?
Definitely, the suppliers who are embracing the change early, they're going to have more opportunity because the buyers, they have to comply. They want to be compliant and they only want to work with, lead generators who are compliant. It's kind of like, you don't want to, if you're a lead buyer, you only want to work with people who are using trusted form or Janaya. Now you want to only work with people who are, getting that consent in a compliant way. So the buyers are going to be vetting out their suppliers even more so. They're going to be watching those playbacks. They want to make sure you're doing things right because they have to protect, themselves as well. And if you can't prove that you're doing it right, the buyers aren't going to want to work with you. So I think if you embrace these changes earlier, you get things set up, you're doing it right, you're going to have a lot more opportunity. Your buyers are going to trust you more and they're going to be happier to work with you and they're going to feel more comfortable. And it's going to be a win-win for everyone at that point.
Absolutely. And speaking of win to wins, let's talk about wins on the consumer side. How could stricter consent requirements lead to better quality leads or even stronger relationships with consumers? And that's going to go first to Ross.
Yeah, so in theory, if a consumer is giving their consent, the lead quality should be better. The main idea of the FCC's ruling is to protect the consumer. The consumer should know what they're signing up for and who's, potentially going to be calling them. So when the consumer receives that phone call, they'll be more prepared. They're gonna, it's not gonna be like they're getting a call out of the blue from solar company 123. Hopefully that consent was given compliantly and they're prepared for that call. They're almost waiting for it. And when they do get that call, they'll have a good conversation. They'll be more prepared to buy, which in theory, again, should lead to a higher conversion rate. So, things should work out for the better.
That's definitely interesting in terms of the context, in terms of awareness for the consumer, knowing who's going to be calling them at any given point in time when they're going through these forms. Garrett, I'm going to bring that question to you as well. How can these consent requirements with FCC and one-to-one essentially lead to almost better quality leads or even stronger relationships with consumers?
Yeah, so to Ross's point, the idea that if a consumer went through the process correctly, gave their consent, and are expecting a call from that specific end buyer, then theoretically you would assume that the lead quality would be better because the consumer's already taken the first step to basically allow that company in particular to reach out to them. So, for example, with the Solar 123 example, if I'm reaching out to get solar, I get a phone call. I look, my caller ID says Solar 123. I'm going to go, oh, Solar 123. I remember speaking to them. Let me jump on this phone, and let me get on the phone. Let's get this conversation going. In theory, you would assume that would make the lead quality better. I think where you might not see it change too much are the situations with pre-selected checkboxes, and depending how that works, because there is the idea that consumers might be sort of skimming through and just going with the normal flow of things, and they might skip over who they're actually consenting to be contacted by. And so the lead quality may just remain the same in that regards. But overall, I think a big change is going to be the drop in the amount of random calls that they're getting. And that is going to overall make the consumer much more likely to pick up the phone, speak to the person, and likely increase the quality of the lead. But it's also on the consumer end as much as it's on the buyer end. So as long as the consumer is reading the information that's being in front of them and actually, consent, checking who the buyers are going to be or the end buyers are going to be, that will help improve lead quality. But if they just skim through it quickly and just hit submit, it may not change anything about the quality of it. So only time will really tell.
Absolutely. And we're very excited to see, how the transition comes in January and also the transitions being made right now with some of the industries as we get a head start on this. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, we're now going to open up the floor to any questions that were answered during our conversation. So first off, we have a question from the audience, and either of you can answer this, but we're also going to obviously go through a live demonstration of some of our one-to-one consent features. One of our users says, very excited about consumer consent. Will this be covered in the meeting today?
I'll jump in on that one. So we're not going to cover it completely. We're kind of getting the finishing touches, completed on our end. As soon as we do have that, we'll either do a YouTube video or possibly a quick webinar, but Garrett might know a little bit better than I do, but we're probably a week or so out from completely launching that. Or we're very excited about that product, and we will keep you guys updated.
Yeah, and with consumer consent, the original idea when we first put it out was it was going to be essentially a standalone product, but we did make the decision over a few weeks ago where now if you're a Lead Prosper user, consumer consent is available as a free tool within your account. So anyone who has a Lead Prosper account can go in, use consumer consent as that middleware for them to be able to collect consent without having to adopt, change and make many changes on the front end. So we're really excited to be able to offer that as a free service and a free product to our Lead Prosper users moving forward. And
And
again,
one more
once
thing.
it,
Oh,
sorry, you go. Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to add one more thing to that. You go to consumerconsent.io, you can watch a video on the product to get an understanding of how it works. And as Garrett was mentioning, we were originally going to make it a standalone product, but we decided to build it into Lead Prosper. And a unique position we have there is now it really is LMS agnostic. So if you aren't using Lead Prosper, but you need consumer consent, you can get a base account with Lead Prosper and tie your campaigns together and, get the benefits of that product. So if you're not using Lead Prosper, but you like the idea of consumer consent, reach out to us. We can show you how it can work with any other LMS out there, and we're happy to help you guys.
It's an exciting solution as we get to crunch time here. And this really transitions us into our live demonstration. We have another question from the audience that says, please take us through the flow of a ping post from the supplier to the buyer, and what are the most important changes that need to be made on that back end and front end. And I think this really layers on to a great transition into our demo in a second. And then couple other questions that we have from the audience in terms of essentially what is the link for the API specs. We'll go over that as well in the next part of this. So we'll come back to the question in a second. And finally, last question before we dive into our one-on-one demo is that our one-on-one seems to be handling passing of TCPA, but some people only want to pass the name as a script. We'll cover that on the webinar as well as to how that is essentially handled. So without further ado, I think it's a great point to transition into kind of the demo and cover some of these more in-depth questions about our one-to-one features on the back end and the front end.
Yeah, for sure. Let me share my screen real quick and we can get started on that. So what I'm going to do real quick is just give you guys a run through of the layout of our new one-to-one campaign type. So this is essentially a brand new campaign type. It's not, it's very similar to our ping post exchange, but with a bit of a functionality change. The biggest changes being that on the ping, you're going to be getting on the ping response, you're going to be getting a ton of new information, including bids and whatnot that could contain items like TCPA name. It could be TCPA description, anything that your buyers are sending back, logo URL, anything that the buyers are returning to you that you can use on the front end to create these dynamic consent boxes. And then the biggest change in terms of functionality is buyer priority and buyer, is all controlled now on the supplier end. So what that means is the supplier on each of these bids in the ping response is going to get a unique bid ID. This bid ID is then going to be used to be passed through on the post. And that is only going to be passed when the consumer has given their consent on the front end landing page. And only if that lead ID, or that bid ID is included in the post, will that post actually take place on the back end. So what that means is if you have 5 bids and no bid IDs come back on the post, none of those posts to the buyers are going to take place. That's how this consent actually takes place. So you never have to worry about a bid being sent if there's not consent as opposed to your buyers. It removes that functionality. So real quick, let me dive in kind of quickly into the new campaign type. So it's very similar to the layout of the existing campaigns. You have your suppliers and your buyers, and you also have your campaign fields. Those are all the same, but we built out a bunch of new one-to-one settings, and I'm only going to give a quick run through of them. We can dive into more of this on another webinar, but basically similar to a ping post exchange, we have bid management settings where you have the ability to set a minimum threshold price. So in this case, on the example, we have a 50 cent minimum bid return price. Any bids that come in under that value will get ignored. Maximum bids returned lets you set a default maximum amount of bids that can be returned on the ping response to your supplier. So if they only have the ability to show 5 bids on their front end, then you can only send them 5 and whatnot. And then we also have, just like with the ping post exchange, the default buyer bid margin. So what this does is this allows you to, when you're dealing with aggregators, create a default margin that could be applied across the board. One thing to keep in mind with the minimum return bid price and the default buyer bid margin is that these can be overridden on the supplier level as well as on the buyer level. So if you need to adjust those margins on a singular case, you have that functionality to do so. Next up, we have some bid display and filtering options. What these do is these allow you to kind of control how the bids are going to be displayed, sorted, and whatnot in the ping response, and also how they're going to work on the post. So first, we have bids order. The default is highest bidder. So basically, your bids are going to come in from your buyers. We'll take those bids, and then they're going to be sorted in an order from highest bid first, and a descending order to the lowest bid last. And then the other option is no order, where in that case, your bids will all be sorted based on the buyer sort order that you have in your campaign. So if I scroll up here, basically the bids for buyer 1 will show up first, buyer 2 will be next in that list, and so on and so forth. The reason for this is there's going to be a lot of front end O&Os where all of the logic for what the bids are being displayed is going to be taken care of on the front end in terms of reading the data from the ping response and populating your bids, your dynamic consent that way. Next feature is a built-in feature that's called deduplicate bids. So when you're dealing with aggregators, you may have the same aggregators dealing with the same end buyers. So you might have more than one buyer return a bid with the same TCPA name. So what this feature does is it basically takes all of the bids that include the same TCPA name and take the bid that the TCPA name with the highest bid and only pass that through, and any others with the same duplicate name will just be ignored from that spot on. Sell to one TCPA entity only. This really has to do with when you're dealing with aggregators and you're also trying to deal with exclusivity. I'll give a very quick overview of the reason for this feature, but basically there's a technical limitation on the ability to return multiple bids to a buyer on a single post basis. So what I mean by that is, say you have buyer 1 and they return 3 bids. If you're trying to sell exclusively, ideally the way it would work is you would say, let me try buyer 1 bid 1. If that fails, try buyer 1 bid 2. If that fails to sell, try buyer 1 bid 3. The problem and where the limitations come into play is almost 99% of the buyer setups that we've seen now, all of your bids need to be included on a single post back to your buyer. So what that means is you cannot do this, ping, post, post, post sort of approach. What this feature does is it will take the highest bid from every single buyer, return those in the ping response. So you'll basically just get a list of every buyer will have a single bid attributed to it, regardless of how many bids they return. And the basically what will happen is also, in terms of exclusivity, is the bids will come through on the post back into your campaign and say buyer 1 bid 1 gets tried. If it sells, that lead is done, and that's an exclusive lead sold. If it fails, it moves on to buyer 2 bid 1. If that sells, it ends, so on and so forth down the list. So it allows you to kind of continue with exclusive lead selling when you're dealing with aggregators in this new sort of one-to-one setup. And then lastly, we have blacklist TCPA names. This is sort of an internal filtering tool to kind of prevent you working with buyers that you may have a bad relationship with or entities that you don't want to do business with. You have the ability now to insert a name here, and it basically filters them out so that you'll never have bids being returned on the ping response for any buyers that are on this blacklist list. And then lastly, sorry, I know this is a ton of information, but lastly, on the API response customization, I'll explain this a bit more when I show you the how it looks. But basically, we have the ability to include a bunch of metadata that's going to be useful for displaying the data on your website in terms of working with the logic, but also when dealing with third-party vendors, this gives them a lot of data that they can use to kind of determine what's going on your end and allow them to make the decisions in terms of optimizing certain buyers, working with buyer IDs, entity names that may not be working correctly, reviewing execution times to ensure their front end functionality isn't lagging due to certain execution times taking too long. So that's kind of what this whole the API customization and response customization includes. So and that's really it in terms of the main one-to-one setting functionality. I'm going to pull up some API specs real quick and kind of show you some of the new features involved in it. But basically, you'll see right away we have a new required field called LP consent bids. What this field is done, it uses it basically when you're sending in your post, this is the field that you're going to include all of the bid IDs in, and that's going to be used to confirm the consent. So only the consented bid IDs would pass through this field, and that's what's going to allow them to actually be posted on the buyer end. So first thing I want to show you is our ping response. Anyone who's used Leapfrog for API specs before know it looks very similar. The big difference is going to be in our basically in the how the responses are structured. So right now we still have the same kind of 4-line format of a very top level ping response, which is common to what we have now. But what we now have included is a bids object. And this object is where all of your bids from your buyers are going to be parsed and then displayed in this bid here. So every bid is going to have its own little array inside of the object. And so right here, you can see that 2 bids were returned. And this is what you would use on the front end to parse this data and display it. So we have here, you can see we have TCPA name. We can have a custom value here. We also included the buyer ID. This is an option you could turn on. This allows you, when you're collecting multiple bids from the same buyer, this allows you to see that in case, for an example would be, say you're working with a dealer or a buyer when you're dealing with exclusive placement in the top of the list, your logic on your front end could say, whenever the buyer ID equals this, put them at the top of the list, regardless of their order or regardless of the bid price. And execution time, this is another really useful tool that's going to be a metric that's going to be needed moving forward, where you're going to be able to, on the supplier end, be able to see how long each of these entity or each of these bids took to execute, so that if you're seeing very high execution time numbers, you can work with the buyer directly to kind of either filter them out, not work with them anymore, or request the buyer brings down the execution times, because these execution times actually directly correlate to what's being displayed on your front end and could cause issues with your conversion. So we're trying to give the suppliers, whether you're the O&O or it's a third-party vendor, as much data as possible to be able to work with. And then we also have metadata, which is basically the overarching ping response metric. So we have total amount of bids, the maximum bid that was returned, and then the total execution time it took. So in this case, when this ping was sent, the total execution time was 0.155 seconds to get all of this data back and sent. Excuse me. And then next, what I want to show you is an example post response, or sorry, an example post that you would be sending in, and really highlight this field here, the LP consent field. Again, this is where you would take the bids that you got in your responses here, and you would copy, you would take these and then insert them comma separated into this field. And this is what would tell the back end, when posted to your LP campaign, these are the bids that we want actually posted to the buyer. Any bids that were in your initial ping response that aren't included here will just get dropped. And then on the post response, the biggest change here is going to be your bids object is going to contain accepted bids. And now you also have the ability to return a bids failed, so that the third-party vendor or whoever the supplier is can actually see what bids failed in the post response and have that data for them for analysis as quickly as possible. That's kind of a brief overview of the campaign settings, the API specs, how things are going. I also quickly want to show you the new, and this I'm going to do this very quickly, the new buyer type. So, excuse me, we have a few different delivery methods by default. We've always had direct post and ping post. We now have a new delivery method, which is one-to-one. It is very similar to ping post in the sense that there is a ping that goes out and there is a post. The biggest difference, though, is going to be when to use a ping post versus a one-to-one buyer. If you're dealing with buyers who are only returning a single bid, you can continue to use a ping post buyer. You don't need to move on to migrate them over to the one-to-one. Really, what the one-to-one buyer is going to be used for is when there's multiple bids. because you're going to have the ability to map the bids object now and be able to go through each bid that comes in, whether it's one bid, two bids, three bids, be able to collect that data, parse it out, and be able to use those bids and pass it through back to your ping response. And let me show you how that would work. So everything else is very standard for a ping post or a direct post setup. You have your payload setup here. You have your basic response mapping. But now what we have is called TCPA and bids configuration. And what this is going to allow you to do is basically map your main bids object or your buyer object, map that object, and then map each individual key and what value is going to be needed for each of those individual bids. So really, if I were to pull up the specs again, let me pull up the ping response, and I can show you real quick what I mean is basically you're mapping the main bids object here. That's the first. And then what you're going to do is go in here and map what the ID, the price, and the TCPA name. These are the three default fields that we need. So, and they might be different. You might have a buyer that specs say, instead of bids, it's called buyers. Instead of ID, it might be bid ID. Instead of price, it might be payout. So this is all going to change, but it's essentially mapping it so that our system can parse each of these individual bids and be able to work with them. Same thing on the post configuration. You set everything up the same way. We did add in a bunch of new functionality that's going to allow you to dynamically create on the payload different arrays, different objects, and whatnot. We can dive into that in another webinar. But we tried to build as much functionality into the transformers and whatnot now that also allow you to dynamically display the different bid IDs and whatnot so that they'll actually meet your buyer's configuration specs. And then the last thing I want to go over real quick is we now have with every buyer a customized API response, very similar to our customized API supplier feature that we have on direct post and ping post buyers now. But really the big thing here is, first off, what I want to point out is ID. So buyer name and ID and bid price, these are all already added in your ping response because we map them above. But the biggest change here is going to be you now have the ability to set any sort of value that might come through, whether it's on the main ping response from your buyer, or if it's on an individual bid level. We now have the ability to parse it and pull it and send it back to all of your ping and post responses so that all that data is available. So basically any data that your buyer is returning to you, we now have a way to map that data, pass it through on the ping and the post response so that your supplier has all the data necessary to properly be able to best optimizing and create, basically display dynamic consent, collect it, and get these conversions. Very, very brief, but a lot of information being passed through. So I'm going to end there in terms of the demo for the backend. But what I want to show, and this goes to one of the questions that was asked, is this is an example landing page that we set up. And what it basically is just a very standard form. But why I want to show you is what it's going to appear here on the right side is going to show you every ping response and how it could be used as an example to populate dynamic consent on your front end. So as you see here, we have a very basic form with a bunch of details filled out. When I hit submit, that is when the first ping request is going to go that you can see right here. So it includes very common information, always have your campaign ID, supplier ID, and your key, and the zip code, project type, whatever. So this is your ping request that was sent to your campaign. And now this is the ping response that was coming back from your Lead Prosper campaign. So what you see here is a real world example of how the bids might be returned. And then on the left here, you can see that we actually use that to dynamically create 3 different boxes here. And what I'm going to do now is only check a single box. And I want to show you how the functionality would work on the post now. So with one box checked, we hit submit selected bids, and the post request is going to now, we have our LP consent bids field, and you see here that we only included that single bid ID that was for top tier solutions. And that appears right here. That came directly from here. And now we have our post response, which includes our bids, what bids were sent. And we can see that they were all accepted, execution times and what have you. And then we also have meta, total execution time, the total amount of revenue, bids sold, total bids and whatnot. So all of this data is going to be available in the ping and the post response. And that is just a very quick real world example of how you can take the ping response data, use that to populate the dynamic consent boxes on your front end, and then use those boxes to submit the proper bid IDs and get that actual true consumer consent. That is kind of a very broad overview that I wanted to go through and really allow you guys to see how it's working in the back end, and also see a real front end example of how a user could use the ping and post responses to work on the front end and display that dynamic consent. I'm going to stop sharing now and basically open the floor to any questions. I know that was probably way too much time. So any questions anyone wants to ask, please feel free.
We actually have a question regarding that tool you just showed. It was an awesome display as to a visualization of what one-to-one consent looks like. The question from the audience is, can this sandbox tool be made available to some of the individuals on our platform so that their devs can essentially see the visualization of one-to-one and get some ideas as to how to navigate that?
That's a great question. We never thought about including that as a tool, but yeah, I don't see why not. Really, I think we absolutely could, whether it's let me go back to the devs and we can have a discussion today about that. And that would be a great tool. Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion. And if it will make our users' life easier with these setups, absolutely. We maybe will do something where we, it's sort of like, I know a lot of our users know about our test buyer tool. Well, maybe we can use something very similar to this in that regard. So that's a great question, actually a great suggestion. Thank you.
We have an additional question from the audience, and it kind of navigates back to the topic of what we call are describing as widgets, or essentially pieces of JavaScript that buyers are requiring to be placed on the page. The question says, your one-to-one solution seems to be handling the passing of TCPA names. Some buyers seem to want to pass the name as a script that only shows to the consumer when placed on the form. How does LP navigate this? How does our team navigate this? Do we have any solutions surrounding this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an example widget. I don't want to say the name because I don't want to feel like I'm putting them on blast. I'm not. But the company that has this, you pass them through a token to their widget, and then their widget displays the information for you on the page. And then essentially you have bid IDs that need to be passed back into your campaign and then displayed correctly in the payload. So while you can absolutely do this, what we did actually to get this to work for one of our customers is we created a hidden campaign field on the back end that was meant specifically for passing these IDs for the specific buyer through. And so what will happen is on the front end, you're passing back that token value. The buyers are then being displayed on the front end. So the front end, all it would need to do is take those bids, pass them back into this new field. We called it, let's just say buyer bids. And that field can then be used using some of our new transformers to then populate and create the box that's needed to send back the information in the payload correctly to your buyer. So it was a workaround. It wasn't ideal, but we sat down, took the time to figure it out. And with the functionality that we have, we absolutely can do something like that. It just depends on, it's individually exclusive to those specific buyers and how their widgets work. But, like I said earlier about our support working directly with users, if you run into these situations, reach out to us. The 99 times out of 100, we're able to come up with a solution. And whether that includes creating new custom shortcodes, creating new custom transformers, we'll come up with a solution for you. So if you're running into these issues, please open a ticket with support. Our support team is incredible. And we'll absolutely be able to sit down, whether it involves jumping on a call with you. We have no problem doing that and figuring out a solution for you in these scenarios where you think there may be some sort of limitation that we can't figure out.
And I definitely want to echo Garrett there. If there is something you're seeing out there and you feel like, or Lead Prosper can't handle it, hit us up, open a ticket, we'll jump on a call. We're happy to work it out. And like Garrett said, 99 out of 100 times, we're going to figure out a solution for you guys. And if you're having that problem, that means other customers might have it too. So we'll build a custom solution for you, and then we'll most likely roll it out to the platform. So definitely reach out. Let's talk about it. We'd love to hear more about any problems you guys are running into.
And we love to see the creativity that's been shown by our team as we kind of navigate through this together with our users. And I think it's an awesome approach. It looks like we're about at time, and I don't see any following questions, but if for for some reason you do have any questions that arise after the webinar, if you're a current user, feel free to open up your support widget in the lower left-hand corner of your software, and we'll be sure to answer anything particular to that, or even jump on a call if needed. If you're not a user, we encourage you to definitely book a call with us for discussion if it's something that you're interested, whether that be consumer consent as an intermediary, or if you're looking at Lead Prosper to facilitate your one-to-one consent. We actually have some users now migrating back onto the platform because of one-to-one consent. In terms of this webinar, this is going to be recorded, or it has been recorded. So if you weren't able to make it, essentially we will send this out to everybody who registered with us, but we'll also send a recording after, so that if you wanted to review individual topics, you can definitely do so. Thank you so much for joining us and spending an entire hour with us. We know that it takes a bit of time out of your day to navigate some of these webinars and give the attention to this, but we certainly appreciate the attendance that's been shown here today. Again, please reach out to our team if you have any questions. We're definitely willing to help.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and please feel free to reach out at any time. We're more than happy to jump on a call and help discuss any questions you may have.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.